It really is historic, and it may be the last time in a generation, for a generation, that we could really challenge these limits, because the limits that were set last reviewed at a full review were in 1996. So they opened up the docket back in 2013, and they just made their determination, which was what we are filed our legal appeal on. They are using this determination to now set limits for 5G, for the higher frequencies in 5G, to allow the FCC to have human exposure limits set for frequencies which are even higher than what they already have set for. And they actually are also taking a swatch of lower frequencies as well. So they're basically widening the wireless frequencies and the electromagnetic frequencies that they have exposure limits set for. And they're saying that they can do that because, well, we looked at the limits from 1996 and everything's fine. Heating is the only problem, so we can now set limits on these new frequencies. So it's really important in the fight against 5G to address what the FCC has done, and that's why we took the step of addressing it. So just for a recap for listeners who might not know, our limits were set in 1996. They're based on science from a decade previous. Rodent studies, some small mammals that looked at short-term heating effects only, and the limits are set on the erroneous assumption that heating is the only harm. So obviously, wireless frequencies are microwaves. When we microwave food, it heats up. We don't want to heat up our brain or body so that we are cooked. That was sort of the thinking, and it gets a little complex, but because actually there's tiny changes in thermal heating can have effects at the cellular level, but I'm digressing a little bit. But the limits were not set looking at what would happen after years and years, or even months and months, or weeks and weeks of low-level chronic everyday exposure like we're getting now. And there was no research that investigated the unique and exquisite vulnerability of children or pregnant women developing brains, or developing immune system. They didn't have that information at the time, and that wasn't a part of the limits, although they say that the limits were designed to protect children, but they don't say that they have documentation that they do protect children and pregnant women. And of course, there's a lot of talk about cancer, and I can talk a lot about the research on cancer, all of which was submitted onto the docket by scientists, by experts, but it's really the tip of the iceberg, because the research on non-ionizing electromagnetic fields that has found an adverse effect at levels which are legal, allowable, includes DNA damage, memory damage, sperm and reproductive damage, synergistic effects like pairing an electromagnetic field with known toxin that we know is harmful, that everyone agrees is harmful, and then you have a potentiation or an increase in the amount of tumors that you would expect with just the toxin alone. Headaches, oxidative stress, which leads to a myriad of effects, impacts to birds, bees and trees, insects, and the list is quite long, actually. It could go on and on and on. So our case is challenging a 2019 order of the FCC, where they said that we've looked at all the evidence that was provided in the docket, and we're not going to change our limits. We're going to keep those 1996 limits unchanged. Now, those limits have to do with a couple things, a lot. You know, it's dozens and dozens of pages of what those limits are. But if you look at this picture and you think about wireless radiation, kind of like you think of smoking. So when the phone is to the head, there is a specific limit that is thermally based that allows a level of radio frequency, a certain rate of absorption into the brain. So we have those limits. We also have limits related to cell tower. How much, if there's a cell tower outside your window, and you're to measure the radiation levels in your home, on the ground, that's a different limit that the government has, it's a maximum permissible exposure level. And there's also limits around, or regulations around, how phones are tested. So I hope everyone knows that phones are not tested for compliance touching the body. They're tested at a distance from the body. And that's another piece of this issue, is the way that devices are tested. And not only that, but the government averages. So the official way that you check for compliance is by averaging the levels that you measure over a 6-minute or 30-minute period. Now, we have contended in our submissions, numerous submissions, that this is inadequate. There's so many problems with the FCC limits. For one, if I were to punch you right now, maybe I would break your nose. But I could say that I'm averaging the power of my punch, because I've now known you for 20 minutes. And if we just average over that time, you'll see that actually the power of my punch was not that strong. And that the way the limits are the regulations are, and I've got a thunderstorm happening, so you might be able to hear the thunderstorm. Think of it like lightning. If lightning were to strike me, according to FCC regulations, you could argue that that could be averaged over time. That doesn't make any sense, because your cells feel the punch, your body feels the punch. The limits aren't even set to consider different modulations. So, about our case, we had a press conference, and we're alleging that so many laws have been violated. And I thought I would share with you a clip of our lawyer, Ed Myers, speaking on the case and what we are contending, because basically the FCC ignored the science on the record. And I think he explained some of that. And you can go online and watch the rest of this. It's just a very short clip.
The FCC decided to terminate its notice of inquiry without taking any action to update the 1996 standards. Our argument in the court is that the FCC failed to meet its statutory obligations. First, under the Communications Act, it has an obligation to protect public health and safety. Secondly, because the agency did not even look at most of the evidence. And what it did look at, it based on a conclusory letter from the Food and Drug Administration, but the FDA provided no analysis either. It was just a short couple of page letter containing a lot of conclusions and no facts. Based on that, we allege in our brief that the FCC acted in an arbitrary and capricious and therefore unlawful manner under the Administrative Procedure Act. It did not engage in any kind of reasoned decision-making, nor did it base its decision to terminate the notice of inquiry on any kind of substantial evidence. And substantial evidence is a legal term, meaning more than a scintilla, but less than a preponderance. So in other words, it's a very low bar to meet, but the FCC didn't even meet that bar. Further, we allege and argue that the FCC violated NEPA because it did not engage in an environmental review of the potential harm to the public and to the environment from its decision, from perpetuating these old regulations and not facing up to the fact that technology has changed. We argued that the decision, therefore, was a major federal action, which is kind of a key term, major federal action that requires NEPA review. And in this case, it was a major federal action, and the FCC should have engaged in an environmental assessment followed by an environmental impact statement, but it did not do either one of those things. Finally, there's a lot of evidence in the record from individuals, some of whom suffer from extraordinary sensitivity to radio frequency radiation. And there's a litany of problems that these people face in their lives, and they're very real. And we demonstrate in the brief that government agencies other than the FCC have recognized that this suffering is a disabling condition, can be an illness or injury, actually, that requires some redress by the federal government and other federal agencies. The FCC didn't even address that evidence, and therefore, again, violated the Administrative Procedure Act by ignoring the evidence, acting arbitrarily and capriciously.
As an example of how the FCC ignored what was in the docket, and that's where all of the, everything was put on the record, they didn't even mention Environmental Health Trust, which is our organization. And we were one of the top filers. There were several of them, but we put a lot of evidence on the record, from research to recommendations. We've met with the FCC several times. We had all of that information in there, and yet nothing. Now, I want to mention there are amicus briefs which have been filed. The Natural Resources Defense Council, which points out issues related to NEPA, as there's extensive research showing impacts to trees, bees, and birds. And something that's really important for everyone to know that I really did not know until I got involved in this about a decade ago, but was quite shocked to understand. There were never limits set to protect birds, bees, trees, wildlife, or a natural environment. It's not that there are unfortunate limits or non-protective limits. There are no limits. The question was never asked, well, what about the impact of trees, especially being that with these small cells, quote unquote small cells for 5G, the hundreds of thousands of new antennas placed near our homes, we have a lot of trees in neighborhoods, and trees are overhanging over these installations. They're obviously going to be highly exposed, but we really have no limit to address that. We have no limit to address insects as well. These questions never came up. There should have been an environmental review triggered, and that's addressed in the Natural Resources Defense Council amicus. Telecom attorney Joe Sandry also states that the FCC acted arbitrarily and capriciously in their action and didn't look at the evidence. And in that amicus brief, there's a declaration by Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who's the former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, talking about the National Toxicology Program, which was touted to be the study that would figure out for $30 million, which is how much it costed, are there non-thermal effects from low-level radio frequency exposure? They looked at in an animal model. The FDA asked for it, the study. The FDA stated that the study wasn't relevant to humans, and the entire study has been discounted. And that is how the FCC, one of the ways that they are making the determination that the NTP doesn't apply. The FDA says it's not an important study. But Dr. Birnbaum talks about the study and the fact that there was DNA damage after the animals were only alive a few weeks. Not just a few, but I think it was 90 days. They lived 90 days of exposure. There was DNA damage found in the brains of rats and mice. So Catherine Kleiber has an amicus brief where she talks about her and her family's injuries, and it's a rather extensive amicus brief with just excellent. All of these are really important to read if you're interested in this case. And the Building Biology Institute talked about harm to clients and people with electrical sensitivities and microwave poisoning, or who've been harmed and don't have a place to live. And so all of this is on our website at ehtrust.org, where if you go to our homepage, you can click on the page about our lawsuit, and we link to everything that I'm talking about today. I had a few quotes. I won't go into them, but I want to make sure to everyone on the call that while the FCC is saying there's no problem, our insurance companies and insurance authorities are not, providing insurance for 5G, electromagnetic, non-ionizing radiation, radio frequency radiation, because they've classified radio frequency and electromagnetic fields, even at compliant levels, as a high risk. And as an example, there's been many white papers. There's usually, just like there's exclusions for asbestos and environmental pollutants, insurance companies have exclusions for electromagnetic fields. One of the white papers that just came out was this by Swiss Re, where 5G is rated as a high impact emerging risk, affecting property and casualty claims in more than 5 years. The title of the chapter is actually Off the Leash, what they call it. And so if our insurance companies won't take the risk, why do we? I know that time's going, so I thought people might have questions, but just to give you a little flavor of what's going on. So the International Agency for the Research on Cancer classified non-ionizing radio frequency as a class 2B possible carcinogen. And that's now about a decade ago, in 2011. In the docket is research showing that, documenting that the evidence base shows that radio frequency is a human carcinogen because of the NTP study and others, and human studies that have found tumors, the same tumors that the National Toxicology Program found in rodents, have been found in humans, the same tumor type. And the National Toxicology Program actually says on their website on this that they themselves, the NTP scientists, reduce exposure to cell phone radiation. The question is, have you changed your cell phone use or what you recommend to your family? And the answer on the NTP page on cell phone radiation is, NTP scientists have become more aware of their usage and follow FDA's tips for reducing exposure to cell phone radiofrequency radiation. They reduce the amount of time spent using your cell phone, and use a speakerphone or headset to place more distance between your head and the cell phone. And really importantly, the NTP has on this web page as well, on the NIEHS or National Toxicology Program page, that they're now going to be studying 5G and doing some new studies. So I guess we're all guinea pigs. If they're studying the animals and they're rolling this out, that's where we are. And this is Brendan Carr, one of the FCC commissioners, talking about some of the misinformation which the FCC put out that we're contending. I thought it would be useful to share what he says. Now, Brendan Carr is a former lawyer who worked for the wireless industry, and in fact was one of the lawyers working when San Francisco passed their Cell Phone Right to Know Act. The CTIA, the wireless industry, argued that it was a violation of free speech for them to do this. And in fact, Berkeley is amidst the same legal lawsuit right now. But Brendan Carr is now our FCC commissioner. And here he is talking about this issue.
The woman that I cited served in the Clinton administration and awarded Nobel Peace Prize. That doesn't necessarily mean that she's right or wrong. I mean, she believed in gravity, that would mean she's right. But she doesn't believe in gravity, that she was wrong. It's not invalidates it. It's just, I bring this up, though. She says this in the article where the article was Dangers of 5G. This is from IB Times. This is not some, this is relatively mainstream published. It says, Dangers of 5G, new technology draws concerns for the environment, public safety. She says this, we are left to wonder, why do China, Russia, Poland, Italy, and several other European countries allow up to 100 of times less wireless radiation into the environment than does the United States? The last EPA report on the topic, released in '86, back when a gallon of gasoline cost less than $1. So she's arguing and postulating we should be more like these countries.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation there. Again, the FDA recently put out this report that looked at studies from 2008 all the way to 2018. it walked through in detail these health and safety studies that they claim don't exist, that show that RF emissions are safe. Again, I think look at the real world. You know, cell phone usage has spiked, incidence of brain and other nervous system cancers have decreased.
Brendan Carr just talked about the FDA report. The FDA came out with a report reviewing a decade of research on cancer and radiofrequency. It didn't look at insects, birds, bees, and trees. It just looked at cancer. It didn't look at oxidative stress. It didn't look at a variety of sperm damage, reproductive damage, brain damage. And they discounted the NTP study. And so that's what Brendan Carr was talking about. And then he says that there hasn't been an increase in nervous system cancers. And actually, in some indexes, there have been some rises in glioblastoma, but we wouldn't necessarily even see that quite yet because it takes decades for glioblastomas to develop. Also, a Yale study just came out with research showing an association between cell phone radiation, this was American Cancer Society funded study, cell phone radiation and thyroid cancer in people with genetic susceptibilities, and thyroid cancer is really on the rise. But this FDA report has been well contested, and if you go to the EH Trust website, we have our press conference on that because we have many scientists calling to retract the NTP, the FDA so-called study, which doesn't have any studies that show safety. They have studies, they have a list of citations of studies explaining what the study found. And for many of the studies that found effects, they have critical statements about those studies. So many which found effects.
Hello. My name is Ronald Melnick. I was a senior toxicologist at the National Toxicology Program at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And while I was a member of the National Toxicology Program, I designed the study that was conducted by the NTP on cell phone radio frequency radiation. So when I saw the report that was just referred to from the FDA, I was concerned that this report misrepresents the utility of the NTP studies for assessing human health risk. So I read the report carefully. I made a number of comments, put these together, and wrote a letter to Jeffrey Shuren, who is the Center Director for Devices and Radiological Health. And in that letter, I noted that this was an anonymous report that misrepresented the NTP studies. In the FDA document, they totally misstate the findings from the NTP on the genetic toxicity of cell phone radio frequency radiation. For example, the report says there was, quote, no statistically significant increase in DNA damage in female rats or either mouse sex. And that's totally wrong. The NTP report shows the increase in DNA damage in the frontal cortex of male mice exposed to both GSM or CDMA modulated radio frequency radiation. They also make the claim that the increases in DNA damage in male rats was not statistically significant, when in fact the results showed significant increases in the frequency as well as in trends for the frontal cortex and hippocampus of male rats. So there are statements in this document which are just 180 degrees incorrect, and these need to be corrected. In addition, they downplay this concept of biological mechanistic plausibility. And that was the basis for actually the NTP study at the time, was that there was no mechanistic acceptance for how radio frequency radiation might cause an adverse health effect other than by heating. And in the FDA report, they even identify a large number of studies that show oxidative stress. There were at least 15 studies that provided evidence of genotoxicity. And oxidative stress is a characteristic of many human carcinogens, and it is known to lead to mutations, chromosomal translocations, genetic instability. So there is a biologically mechanistic plausibility for radiofrequency radiation, which the FDA report just simply dismisses as non-existent. In addition, they only considered in vivo studies. And if you are trying to understand a mechanistic process, in vitro studies are extremely important. And there are numerous studies from in vitro, this would be outside of the animal, in vitro studies demonstrating oxidative stress and genetic toxicity. So the consequences, the radiofrequency radiation may not by itself have enough energy to break bonds, but it, by inducing oxidative stress, can lead to DNA damage, and DNA damage is an early event that could lead to cancer.
It's important for people to understand something. You, Dr. Melnick, were one of the world's experts in this field, and you were invited to participate by the World Health Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, to the only independent expert review we've ever had at that time in 2011 of all of the data assembled then. Subsequently, you and I and others have looked at the more recent information that has been accumulated. And I would ask, and Dr. Baldwin is aware of this as well, I would ask each of you to comment on your opinion on the following question. When it comes to understanding the kinds of evidence we have about cancer in humans, would you say at this point we have some evidence, we have compelling evidence? Put it in terms that people can understand, because people do not understand these terms, probable and possible carcinogen. How would you say it to the ordinary person in terms of what precautions should be taken now and why? I'll ask Dr. Melnick and then Dr. Baldwin.
Well, I think the evidence is quite compelling. When I see multiple studies demonstrating an increased relative risk, that concerns me substantially. And I feel that the FDA message, by dismissing the entirety of the animal studies, the human studies, and mechanistic studies, which we haven't even discussed yet, is an irresponsible approach, because it implies that precautionary measures are not necessary. And if you ignore multiple studies showing a response in humans and animals, you are not protecting or promoting public health.
And so this is all on our website, and there were several scientists who wrote to the FDA calling to retract that report, including scientists from all over the world, actually, on impacts to trees. We have former Fish and Wildlife biologist who talked about the impacts to birds. And that study is what the FCC, in the order that we're challenging, is referring to, even though the study hadn't come out when the FCC made its order, but the FCC is saying that the FDA says everything's fine. Our sister agencies say everything is fine, even though the only sister agency that we could see was one paragraph, literally, by the FDA, in an FDA letter, in a few-page letter, but one paragraph on this. And so there's a lot to talk about, but that's what the legal appeal is about, and the FCC is going to make their reply to our brief. The due date is in September. Then we do a reply to their reply, and then oral arguments will be in the spring, we expect. So we're looking at about a year when we'll have a determination on this case.